Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Arcade Tirade, the podcast that's all about video games. I'm your host, Zuve. Phantom Outlaw won't be making it this time. This is episode 7 for January 14th, 2019. Let's do the show. So, currently, as I am recording this, I am sitting in my room. It is snowing for what will be a 2.5-day or 2-day interval. It started Friday night. It's supposed to go all day and end off in Sunday. But I love this. This is the first real snowstorm of the winter. I feel like I'm completely trapped in. It's like that childish feeling you're cut off from the world. That's something I've always liked about the snow, especially like a big snow. There's something that just mutes the daily life. To me, it slows things down so you can appreciate things more. I don't know. Maybe I sound like a doofus. Whatever. So, as far as what I've been playing lately, it's really just more Smash Brothers. There's a lot to it. Honestly, I haven't had much time for gaming outside of that. I've been busy working with other things with my band and the job and job hunting, and that's always a lot of fun. So I'm trying not to work myself too hard. I've got multiple things I'm doing at the same time. The band's working on a music video. Again, the job hunting, already working my regular 40-hour-a-week job. And so planning this podcast also takes some work. You've got to do your research. But let's talk about news, since I don't have much for what's going on lately. I will say this. As of right now, we're on the 22nd day, the longest government shutdown in history. Now, I did some reading up on this. This broke the record from back in 95 during the Clinton administration, which went on for 21 days. So, the president wants his wall, and regardless of your opinion on the wall and your partisanship or what have you, you have hundreds of thousands of people, government employees, that aren't being paid, and many of them still have to go to do their job anyway. That's ridiculous. I don't care, again, I don't care what opinion you have as far as how things should be run, how we should handle things. These are people just like you that are dependent on a paycheck in order to survive, and this won't happen because our president is being hard-headed, is being bullheaded, which isn't unusual for somebody like him. It's just frustrating. It's just frustrating. That's all I have to say on that. This is a video game podcast, not politics. All right, so news. New release for March 29th on the Switch, Yoshi's Crafted World, which looks like, I've seen the trailer. It looks to be another Yoshi platformer of the Yoshi's Island variety, Yoshi's Story. Hopefully better than Yoshi's Story, though. I was not a fan of that game. Too short, way too easy. I'm also not really a fan of the art style that they've taken in recent times with the toyish, doll, stuffed animal look. That doesn't mean that I would dislike it as a game. That's just an aesthetic preference. But still, it looks like it could be a pretty good game. I mean, Nintendo usually is pretty good with their main IPs. So time will tell how that will turn out. There are a couple of new online releases for the NES Virtual Console on the Switch. So, Blaster Master and Legend of Zelda 2 Link's Adventure will be coming January 16th. So, both solid games. Zelda 2 often gets a bad rap, but I think if you look into it, you'll find that the game was better than a lot of people give it credit. It's the black sheep of the Zelda series. But then again, that often happened with Part 2s in a lot of series. It was still a new franchise, and they still wanted to try new things, and they didn't know exactly what worked. So, other news, I read about this earlier last week, and it was sensationalized. It was spun to be a bigger deal than it actually is. It was just the president of Nintendo Japan, Shintaro Furukawa. He was in an interview, and They asked him about his approach to the changing technology of the time, and when they asked him about how the company intended to innovate in a risk-prone business, Furukawa said or hinted that Nintendo may one day move away from home console development. And then a lot of different outlets, Nintendo-centric outlets especially, started blowing it out of proportion and saying that this was going to be Nintendo has made its decision that it's going to pull out of the console business or the console industry, which just isn't true. It was just something that the president suggested at one point in an interview. So nobody get your panties in a bundle. It's just some talk about something that might one day happen. I think it's very likely that one day main game developers will move away from consoles entirely. I think that we have platforms such as Steam, and I'm sure there are others out there now, and I think that it's very possible that one day you could see Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, and others competing alongside. Now they might. It's really hard to say how that would turn out because you're not going to want companies to just be able to have a third party come out and release a console that's compatible with all their games. It seems like they would still want to have the means of producing those consoles. They wouldn't want to miss out on that. I don't know exactly the financial situation behind what the costs would be with or without a console, so I'm not completely sure. So that's just speculation on my part. So moving on to the main topic. Today's episode is going to be not so much riffing as much as it's going to be dictation history. A dive into the culture and brief history of emulation. So you're all familiar with emulation, whether you know it by that name or not. We all know Nintendo's Virtual Console, the eShop, or the Xbox Microsoft Store, where you can buy and download older games or newer independent games, or even the console's owned games. But do you know the history behind them? It all started with emulation. An emulator itself is hardware and or software which enables a computer system to behave like a different system. So, for instance, you could have a program on a PC that runs the Windows operating system, but the program can run DOS, and those are out there, among many, many others. What I'm talking about, though, is a video game console emulator, which allows a computing device to behave like a game console and play video games. Usually, emulators are superior to the corresponding consoles because they don't have the same limitations. And if you want a good example of this, run a Nintendo 64 and then look at the N64 emulator that's run on a PC. You'll see the graphics are much smoother. Same for PlayStation 1. So, some of the features that push the limitations include a variety of controller compatibility. You can control the speed of games. The graphics are clearer. You can use save states, which means that you can save any moment in a game at any point, regardless of save files, and just jump back there anytime you want, which makes things a lot easier for those really difficult games. Also included are memory mods, such as Game Shark or cheat codes, and they're used to help develop homebrews, which is something that we'll talk on later, homebrews. So the games that you run on an emulator usually come in the format of ROM files. Those are copies of game files, also known as ISO images. They're created using special tools or optical drives. Despite claims, most games retain their copyright. Generally, this means that gamers seek these ROMs out for free through various websites and torrents, which, of course, there's been a lot of cracking down by Nintendo on these sites as of the last few months. There are exceptions, again, like I said, to ROMs, such as the Retrode, which allows emulators to access the data on a cart without ripping it. So I'd like to talk about the history of emulation now. It starts in the mid-90s, when the first console emulators appeared. They were usually incomplete and often defective. Programmers used reverse engineering to figure out the workings of the consoles after this. The NES, SNES, and Game Boy were the most often studied consoles. Worth mentioning from this era also is Yuji Naka's unreleased emulator that could run on the Genesis. Eventually, this innovation led to gamers getting access to titles that were never localized in their region, which was always one of the positives that I enjoyed about emulation. There are a lot of franchises that we still wouldn't know much about if it weren't for that. We, of course, being here in the United States or in Europe. Hackers could translate the games and apply them through patches. This exposed gamers to Nintendo's censorship policies as they were shown uncensored versions through hacking. Good examples of this were RPGE's English version of Final Fantasy V, or Demiforce's Earthbound Zero, which was the translation of Mother, the prequel to Earthbound that we got on the Super Nintendo. This, of course, in turn drew more people into the emulation scene. During the old days, emulation was in a legal gray area for a time. So in 1994, the Sony PlayStation is released. In 1997, PlayStation emulators emerge, such as the PS Emu Pro and Psych, yet they weren't very reliable and were seldom updated. Then in 1999, two emulators were developed for commercial release, Bleem and the Connectix Virtual Game Station. Now, a key difference between these two programs and most emulators of the time is that they required the actual game discs to run them instead of ROMs. Sony took them to court regardless. Though the two emulation companies won the case, Sony's power and legal tactics stopped them. However, this brought the subject of emulation into the mainstream for the first time. Bleem was the main culprit. In late 1998, word began to spread about an emulator that played PS games and enhanced them as well. Developed by Randy Linden, who had a history with developing gaming emulators. Bleem used the standard computer's video card capabilities to enhance the graphics and speed of PlayStation games. Bleem Beta leaked in January of 1999. People were shocked. Sony sued Bleem for violation of IP and copyright infringement. Yet Bleem stood their ground. Sony was denied twice to get a temporary restraining order against the release of Bleem. Then Bleem took their product to E3. In the first month, Bleem sold over 50,000 copies at $29.99 each. They were sold at most major games and electronics stores of the time. Meanwhile, Sony and Bleem continued their legal quarrel. Sony tried to stop Bleem from using screenshots of their games on their packaging. Yet the courts ruled that the images, which showed their graphical superiority, would be allowed under the grounds of comparative advertising. By the end of 1999, Bleem was working on a program that could run Dreamcast games. But by 2001, sales for Bleem had slowed down. This was due to development issues and the ongoing legal battle with Sony. Bleem's emulation plan was narrowed down to specific disc-based releases known as the Bleemcast series. 3 games were released under this title. Meanwhile, Sony threatened to pull their support or sue stores which chose to sell Bleemcast discs. In November of 2001, with the sales on the downward and more legal threats from Sony looming, Bleem finally called it quits. So for more details on the history of the story, for more details on that particular story, I would recommend the Gaming Historian's video. The Gaming Historian is a guy on YouTube that does a lot of research and episodes where he talks about different things in the history of gaming. Often some of the more obscure things that we've forgotten, or in a lot of instances I had never heard of before. So let's talk about something I had mentioned earlier, homebrews, and what emulation made possible. So, again, emulation brought about a lot of awareness in the gaming community about titles that we, without it, likely would have never been able to experience unless we learned Japanese. Now, most of the examples I'm going to be using here are RPGs because they're the ones that are text-heavy, and they weren't that popular in the West in that time, so back in the 90s, a lot of the time, you just wouldn't get some of the more popular RPGs in the States. And that includes Seiken Densetsu 3, which was the sequel to The Secret of Mana. the early Final Fantasy series was just a real clusterfuck back in the 90s because Sony released Final Fantasy 1 in the States, but then they didn't release 2 or 3. And then when they finally released 4, they just called it Final Fantasy 2 in the United States. And then when they released Final Fantasy 6, they called it 3 because we had never gotten 5 or 6. Or a 3, for that matter. So by the time they got to 7, they just said, screw it, we're just going to call it 7 in both countries. But a lot of gamers learned the truth behind that with translation. Again, as I had mentioned, the Mother series, Earthbound 0, and of course Mother 3. And Dragon Quest 5 and 6, that is before they were finally re-released in the United States on the Game Boy Advance. Another peculiar case was the game Terranigma, which was an action RPG that wasn't released in the States, but it was released in Europe. And, of course, all of the Satellaview games, which was Super Nintendo's broadcast service where you could download and play games or samples or demos of games for a time, but it was only released in Japan. And that includes SF Wars, the SNES Zelda remakes, the SNES Zelda original game they released, which was stylized after A Link to the Past, but it was a completely new plot. And, of course, the remakes for the Super Nintendo of Dragon Quest 1 through 3. As for homebrews, there are too many to mention. Many hacks of pre-existing games emerged, as well as some originals inspired by these games. The strongest example is probably Undertale, made by Toby Fox, who started out by hacking Earthbound, and was inspired by the series to make his own. As for emulation today, commercial gaming emulation on major consoles is commonplace, as mentioned before. The indie market has exploded with many independent games inspired by retro games, as well as retro games made available per console. So, this is a short episode, but I'll end things with my thoughts on the whole subject. If you create a product to sell for a profit, you should be entitled to make the money off of that, and I don't agree that it should be allowed that people can get the copies of it for free. I've seen the hardships of this as a musician with what I would consider theft, basically. Programs such as Spotify, where artists make hardly a fraction of a penny per song streamed. And I get that that's legal, although I don't think that it should be. But the point that I'm getting at is that if you make a product, you should get paid for it as long as you're not putting it out there for free. If people are pirating that, then they should be stopped. Now, I understand that it's impossible to stop everybody downloading ROMs. So what I would suggest, I don't have a problem when game makers go after the large distributors or they shut down these big sites. And I know that people like to use the old idea, oh, well, their copyrights have worn off. That's generally just not true. Their copyrights are still in effect, and they often renew those. So they still have the rights to those IPs, to those games. So I suppose I would consider myself moderately hawkish when it comes to protecting your own property. Again, I say moderately because I understand that you're not going to be able to stop, mass ripping off massive illegal downloadings, especially once you reach a certain scale of availability. You just can't go after everybody. You don't even know who everybody is that's doing this stuff. I'm not going to say that I've been completely innocent. I generally go for games that I would never be able to play regardless, or games that I already own a copy of. Sometimes I feel like I've paid my dues to a lot of these developers already, but I don't know. It's a gray area. I understand a lot of people say, well, it's not really a gray area. Screw these consoles. They make enough money. Screw these console developers. They make enough money as it is. I don't care if they're going to miss out on my $59 or my $12 or $29.99, whatever you would have to actually pay for the game. A lot of these games are out of production anyway, and if you were to buy a hard copy, the developer wouldn't make any money anyway because it's already resale. You're buying used. I'm talking about old NES, SNES, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2. So, again, I don't agree with getting someone's product they're trying to make money off of for free. It's theft. That's all that is. It's theft. Anyway, those are my thoughts on emulation. I'm curious if you hopefully you have your own thoughts. No, what I was going to say is, let me know. Do you agree? Do you not agree? Should I go to hell? I don't know. Well, I've got a lot of work to do around the house. Probably going to have to trudge out into this snow hell and make a trip to the corner store. So, I don't know what the weather is for you guys out there, but take care. Be safe. Don't drink and drive. And I guess this is it for today. So, short episode, of course, much shorter than usual, but this was more of a dry subject, something that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. So I'm glad that I did it. So everybody have a good one. This is Zuve signing out. We'll see you next time.